In this video, we're going to go over the basic animation system found in Modo. I've gone ahead and populated my scene with a very simple little teapot. If you want to add your own teapot to your scene and follow along, you can do so by going up to the top of the screen where it says Geometry, and under either the Primitive Tools or the Unit Primitives, you can just add a teapot. So I want in new mesh teapot right there, and this is what I got. Okay, so let's just talk about some of the moving parts and pieces of the animation toolset. Okay, I'm in the animation tab, and as you can see over here on the left hand side, Modo has already loaded in all the animation tools, and there's really kind of broken up into a couple different areas. We have a number of icons up over here that will allow us to very quickly insert locators, cameras, lights, and then of course we have all of our transform tools down below. In addition, there's some advanced rigging tools available to us down here in the bottom part. And because there's so many tools, they've actually broken out this little window into two separate tabs. We have all of our tools in the commands tab, and then our tool properties found in the second tab over here. Our OpenGL viewport pretty much has remained the same. A couple small little inclusions at the top here, including composition, this new little setup button that we'll talk about much later, and then of course some drop actions as well. These are two new additions to 601 that I'm really excited about. More on that later. And probably the largest addition to the animation window, or this animation tab, is of course all of our animation timeline stuff found down here at the bottom. So our timeline, let's just kind of go through the moving parts and pieces of our timeline. The default Modo timeline looks something like this. And inside our little ruler here, our graph, you can see a whole bunch of little tick marks. And each one of these tick marks on the graph represents a frame in time. So we're no longer looking at just a static model. We're now looking at a series of frames that are then going to be rendered out upon completion. Now, right now, if you look very, very carefully, the number 0 is white, and you can see a little tick mark there, a little white tick mark. Well, that number, the white 0 and the white line, represents the playhead. And the playhead is basically the moment in time that you are currently previewing. If you want to preview a different moment in time, simply left-clicking anywhere on the timeline here will allow us to jump the playhead forward to the moment in time we clicked on. We can also left-click and drag and interactively scrub our animation in the timeline like this. Now, I don't have any animation going on with my teapot at the moment, so nothing's really happening. But just know that left-clicking and drag will allow you to scrub, and then single left-clicking can allow you to very quickly jump around the duration of your timeline. Now, immediately below your timeline, you have a whole series of a whole bunch of really fancy buttons and knobs. And let's just kind of go through them one by one and really explore their role inside the animation production pipeline. We're going to first start off with these things over here, these sets of numbers. And I want to draw your attention to the two sets of numbers on the left, and then also quickly jump way over here to the right because we have another set of numbers. Now, these sets of numbers are related. The outside set, so this one right here, and of course, this one right here, represent the total duration of our scene. So it would be the scene start number and the scene end number. So currently, the way we have our timeline set up is that when we render this animation, or when we animate our scene, we have the frame 0 to frame 120 available to us. So think of this kind of like the total duration of our timeline. Now, these inside numbers are a little bit different. These inside numbers are kind of the preview range, and we can interactively change which range of frames that we want to look at in the total duration of our timeline. So instead of looking at the entirety of our timeline, maybe we only want to look at a small portion. So by changing these values, so maybe I only want to preview the animation starting at frame 20 and then ending at frame 60. Okay, so if you look at my timeline now, the numbers on my graph have been reduced, and now I'm physically only previewing 20 through 60. Now, there's a couple other ways that we can interactively adjust the preview range, or the current start and current end value for our timeline. Look immediately below our little timeline here, our graph, and you're going to see this kind of light gray bar. At the outside of this light gray bar, we have two little cubes, and these cubes are interactive, meaning that we can left-click and drag on them and change interactively the current start time and the current end time. So that's a kind of a handy-dandy little trick. So instead of having to go in and add values here, you just left click and drag. In addition, if you look at the center of this gray bar, this number here, mine is currently saying 51, is communicating to us the total number of frames that we are viewing. So right now we're viewing 51 frames out of a sequence that starts at 0 and ends at 120. So as I interactively drag, now I'm only previewing 34 frames out of my 120 available to us. Now, if we like this duration, this preview range, we can left click and drag in the center of this and drag it anywhere around in our timeline. And the current start and current end values will update accordingly. So this is kind of a handy dandy little trick. I use this all the time to jump around my timeline and to globally see how everything's working, or if I want, I can just go in and just take a look at a very small little chunk. Okay, so that's the preview range values, which are on the inside. So keep in mind, the total duration, the total length of your timeline is established by the outside set. So that one right there, this one, and this one, that represents the total duration of your timeline. Now, the default value for Modo for the beginning of your animation is frame 0. I would caution you against using frame 0 as the default, as many other compositing applications don't have a default value of 0 as the first frame of their animation. So what I normally do is I go in here and I just change that to 1. Okay, that way we render frame 1 through 120. It's a little bit more universal. I can't recommend you doing this enough. Okay, one other thing that I want to show you are the kind of standard VCR play controls found here in the animation palette. These VCR play controls are going to act or are going to behave much the way you think that they're going to behave. So most importantly, we have the big play button here in the center, and that's just going to play our animation. Again, we don't have anything right now, so everything's static. This is going to loop the animation, so check it out. As the playhead gets down over here to 120, it's just going to go back in and loop the animation over and over and over again. To stop the animation, simply hitting the stop button will go ahead and pause our animation. Now, inside these play controls, these outside arrows are going to allow us to skip to either the beginning of our animation or inversely to the end of our animation way over here. Now, the ones that have the little cubes next to them are going to allow us to very quickly navigate to the next or previous keyframe in the animation. So you need to have keyframes down before you really can start working with these guys. We also have a pause button here, which is kind of handy, so we can pause the animation and keep going as well. All right, so those are the VCR play controls found here in the center. Now, the other thing that's really, really important about this timeline are all of our options. Now, this is really important. Before you do any animating, you want to double check your option, because there are a couple landmines in here that will explode in your face if you don't really give it some attention. So if we click on our options button here, it's going to bring open all of the animation options found in Modo. And again, we have the option to change the scene start and end values like we just discussed here, and the preview values down below. Now, the part that's really important is the time format and the frame rate. I apologize if the bottom portion is getting cut off on your screen, but this time format is important. If you're working in the feature film industry, working in a frame-based environment, so a progressive-based environment is totally cool. But I do a lot of stuff for broadcast. I do a lot of animating for television. So my time format isn't necessarily going to be in frame. If you click on this button, you're going to see all the different frame or time format options available to us. We have seconds, frames, SMPTE, and then film code. For me in the television world, having a SMPTE time code base on my timeline is extraordinarily valuable. Now my timeline here in Modo is going to match my timeline in Final Cut Pro or even in After Effects. So this is really important to understand and something you want to look at before you start animating. In addition, you also want to make sure that you change your frame rate. Before you animate a single keyframe here in Modo, you need to know exactly where this animation is going to be played. So if you're going out into the feature film world, the default value of 24 is just dandy. But if you're like me, working in broadcast, you might want to change it to NTSC 2997. So just know what the final deliverable is going to be and the final distribution medium is before you even start animating. You don't want to animate in one time code or one frame rate and then have to reconvert it into another. That's just a ton of work, and the results usually are pretty poor. So just know what your frame rate's going to be at the outset of this project. I'm going to leave mine at 24, just kind of make it easy. If you need to, it's getting cut off on the screen, but there's also the option for a custom frame rate. So if you need to go in and make your own custom frame rate, you can do that as well. Let's just leave it at the value of 24, which is the default, and then go forward from there. In addition, also, one last thing in your options, we have the ability to open up our graph editor. There it is, kind of our floating palette. This is not the only place that we have access to our graph editor, but it is definitely a welcome one. Okay, so the option key or the option button, make sure you go through that. Now, I said a moment ago that there's a couple places that you can open up the graph editor. For me, the easiest way to open up the graph editor is just by grabbing that guy right there. That little button is going to open up our graph editor. Now, I'm going to have an entire video dedicated to the awesomeness of the graph editor. Good animators understand how to use the graph editor. That's where the final finesse and tweak and polish pass for all of our movements is going to happen. So more on the graph editor much, much later. I happen to really enjoy how Modo has implemented their graph editor. It's very clean, very easy, and an extraordinarily powerful tool for us animators. So let's close that and continue on down the way. Now, this next one is going to allow us to drop all of the selected channels from either a keyframing or from the graph editor. I usually don't use this very often, but it's something you might want to explore. In addition, these buttons over here, so this one and these three, are interface elements that will allow us to add keyframes either globally to an entire item, or we can add keyframes to either the transform section, the rotation with this button, or the scale values with this last button. So we can do it globally, which will place a keyframe on all three, or we can get a little bit more specific and focus the computer on adding keyframes for either the position, the rotation, or the scale values. One last thing, we also have an auto key option in the animation palette here in Modo. So if you look at it very carefully, we have a couple options for the auto key. Now the cool thing about auto key is that you set one initial keyframe, and then any additional edit that you make to that mesh item is automatically going to generate a new keyframe on that frame, which is pretty cool, right? That definitely saves us some trouble when we're animating complex scenes, or if we just want to work quickly. Some folks love having the auto key on. Some folks don't like having it on. So we have a couple options here. Of course, you can turn it off, or the default is animated. Now, what this is going to do is that it's only going to add additional keyframes on a channel that's already been animated. So, for example, if I go in and animate the rotation of my teapot along the y-axis, the auto key is only going to add rotation keyframes for the y-axis on future frames. Okay, so this is only going to add keys on channels that are currently have keyframes applied to them, or we can just set it to all, and then it will place a keyframe on every single channel on this entire item every time we make a change to it. I would really recommend that you stay away from all. I'm a big believer that as animators, we need to wrangle our keyframes. We need to be as efficient with our keyframes as we can. I kind of have an old saying that mo keyframes, mo problems. So we want as few keyframes on our item as we possibly can get away with. So definitely I would recommend that you stay away from all. Animated is usually where I hang out. Okay, so the bottom part of our animation palette down here is new in 601, and it's really cool. All of these options down here at the bottom are specific to the new character posing system that's found inside of Modo. We're going to have an entire video that's going to explore all of these little options. So more on this later, but just know that these are the posing options and the posing tools of which we will go into in great detail. Okay, let's start going in and start animating our little guy here, because this is a pretty boring static scene. So let's just kind of get going. So to illustrate the animation process or the animation engine here in Modo, I'm simply going to have my little teapot go from the right side of the screen to the left side of the screen. I know this is an award-winning animation. This is definitely the best thing I can possibly come up with. No, I'm joking. It's a horrible animation, but it definitely is going to illustrate the entire system. So let's check it out. So one important element. all animation happens in item mode, okay? So we're never, ever, ever going to be animating vertices, edges, polygons, and certainly not materials. All animation happens at the item level, so please make sure you're in item mode before we start any of this. I get a lot of folks that get frustrated with me because they don't understand that animation doesn't happen at the component level. It happens at the item level. One really handy dandy keyboard shortcut when working with the animation tools is the number 5 key on your keyboard, and those are the keys at the top of the keyboard. The number 5 key is the keyboard shortcut to go into the item selection set. So just keep that in mind. You're going to see me jumping around between all of these three, and if you see me automatically toggle the item mode without going up and pressing, that's usually because I've just hit the 5 key on my keyboard. Okay, so I'm in item mode. Let's go over to my item list and select my teapot. Now, if you don't have your little mesh tab selected over here on the right, go ahead and select it, because we're going to want to get access to all of the transform channels for this item. Okay. So as I mentioned, what we're going to do here is that we're going to animate my teapot going from this side of the screen down the positive Z axis over here to the left side of the screen. So let's walk through the basic animation system here in Modo. Notice that my playhead's at frame 1, and let's go ahead and grab the move tool. All right. So when I activate the move tool, notice that over here in the properties tab, all 3 of my position channels have little orange backgrounds, and I'm just going to select them all, okay? So notice that little orange background. That indicates that these channels have been selected. Now, without adding a keyframe, just manipulating the tool handle here will interactively change the value for the Z axis. But we just don't want to change it. We want a keyframing, okay? Keyframing is nothing more than the computer going in and capturing a bit of information. It's basically capturing that value, so 11.5 inches. I want to place this just a little bit back. There we go. So I want the computer to remember that on frame 1 of my animation, the position of my teapot along the Z axis is going to be 1 inch. So let's lock that down. Let's save it. There's a couple ways that we can save that value at this moment in time. Remember, this is called keyframing, okay? So there are a couple easy ways. First and foremost, if you go back down to the bottom of the screen, you can very easily hit this gigantic key button. Now, what this is going to do is that it's going to add a keyframe on the selected channel. Now, notice that the background color of the channel indicator here has included a little red dot. That little red dot is an important UI element. That little red dot on the channel indicates that a keyframe has been applied to just the Z channel. In addition, if we check out the timeline down here, we have another piece of UI that's magically shown up, and it's this little white cube. That's the Modo UI icon for a keyframe on the timeline. Okay, so we've locked in this value on frame 1. Let's advance my playhead to right about here on frame 60 and move my teapot. All right. Since my auto key is set to animated, the computer automatically added a new keyframe on frame 60 and saved in that new value. So check it out. My playhead is still on frame 60, and if I go back to explore the Z channel over here in my transform tab, you can see that that value of 6 feet 10 inches and a quarter has been locked in because we had that little red dot there. This is once again reinforced by the fact that we get a little cube here that's connected with a green line to the cube that was on frame 1. Let's scrub the playhead. Yeah, I'm just left clicking and dragging here, which is called scrubbing. And you can see that animation is taking place and the computer is transitioning between those values. So really what we're doing when we're keyframing items inside of any 3D package is that we're locking in a value on specific frames. So again, on frame 1, I've captured and locked in that value of 1 inch along the Z axis. On frame 60, I've locked in a value of 6 foot 10 inches and a quarter on frame 60. And then the computer is transitioning, it's interpolating, if you will, between those two locked in values, between those two keyframes. So the computer is figuring out what it needs to do to get my teapot from the location here on frame 1 to its location here on frame 60. The computer is doing the rest, okay? Pretty cool, huh? Pretty cool. Okay, so there's a couple other things that we can do to keyframe our little teapot. A couple other animation features that I want to show you. Okay, so I'm going to go back to frame 1 here, and I mentioned before that these 4 buttons are going to allow us to keyframe either globally or specifically towards the position, the rotation, and the scale. So check it out. I'm going to go back over here to frame 1, and this time I'm not going to click on the Z channel. I'm just going to click on this first one. Now watch what happens. Because I clicked on this first one, which is the command to add a keyframe for all of the position. Notice that I now have keyframes placed on both the X, Y, and Z. Okay, so we can just individually keyframe channels with this button, or we can keyframe all 3 channels of the position, rotation, and scale properties of the transform by toggling these buttons here. So a couple different ways to put keyframes down. In addition, let's do this. Let's go maybe after frame 60, maybe over here on frame 90, my teapot is going to go up. Now, if we wanted, what we could do here, we could also keyframe by right-clicking on the little red dot and choosing Add Key. That's another way we can do it, okay? Check it out. We also have Add Key, and here's an easy way of removing keyframes from our timeline. There's also one additional way that we can work inside of this this structure. Let's go back over here to frame 60. Now, I don't have a keyframe on frame 60 for my Y, so I'm going to just put this down to 0. Now, the other way that we can add a keyframe on frame 60 is to hit the S key. I got that channel selected, and you can very easily select these channels by either clicking on the dots, okay? Or, for me personally, what I would do is that I would click on the background, okay? You hover over these areas, and you can see that the background highlight color kind of changes into a light gray. You can actually click on the dots to toggle them on and off. So just kind of beware. If it's not red, that means you've deleted the key. If I click on the dot, the key's been preserved. Let's just put that back down to 0. All right. Yeah, there we go. And now we can see my lovely little animation. So keep in mind, a couple different ways to add and infuse keyframes to your timeline. You can either do it on a per channel basis with this button. You can either do it for the position, the rotation, and the scale parameters globally all at the same time using these buttons. You can also hit the S key, S as in September, to add a keyframe on a selected channel, or you simply can just click on the little dots over here in the channels. Which is pretty cool. So a number of ways to add keyframes to your object here in Modo. So let's a couple other things about animation. Now, we can animate multiple channels going on at the exact same time. My animation at the moment just has my teapot going from the left to the right and then kind of up again. Well, what if I wanted to kind of rotate as well? Well, let's do that. Let's jump over here, and I'm going to interactively select some rotation channels. Notice that I've moused over the background of the rotation X area. Now, if I wanted to add a keyframe for all 3 of these values at the exact same time, I could go into each of these these guys and add a keyframe, or we can select all 3 at the exact same time and key all 3 at the exact same time. Let me show you what that looks like. So I got the top one selected. I'm going to hold down my Shift key and select the Z channel for rotation. And notice that it selects all of the channels in between. So it automatically selected that Y channel for me. Now I can key this and go and continue moving forward. So I think since I got them already selected, I'm just going to hit the S key. Okay. Notice that the little red dots for those channels have appeared. I also get a white cube in my timeline. And then over the course of 90 frames or so, I think maybe I'll just have this guy rotate 360 degrees on the Y. Yeah, and there it is. Now it's rotating. Pretty fun, huh? And last but certainly not least, we can't leave the scale out of the system here. Let's go ahead and have some fun with scale. Maybe over the last 30 frames or so, as it's moving vertically along the y-axis, the size of my teapot is going to shrink. So let's look at how we can do this. So once again, we have options. I think for this one, I'm going to go in and just click on the actual little dot on each channel. Keyframes shown up down here in my timeline, so I know I've locked in those values. So over the next 30 frames or so, let's go ahead and put this down to 10%. So it's going to lose, or it's going to get smaller by 90% over those 30 frames, and you can see it getting smaller there in the screen. Okay, let's play our animation. Oof, award-winning, fantastic. Fantastic. Okay, so what if you need to go in and edit the location of these keyframes? Well, it's a little bit of a challenge, and it's kind of hidden how you do this. There are two ways that you can edit the location of your keyframes. The first way is to go into the graph editor. Now, if I click on this button in my animation palette, the graph editor is going to pop up on the screen. Now, the graph editor is definitely an advanced window, but the more experience and the more exposure you have to the graph editor, the easier you're going to find this interface and this workspace to work within. Excuse me. So, the graph editor works off of a very simple property here. What we're doing here is that we are editing our keyframe values in a two-dimensional graph. And if you look very carefully at the way this graph is laid out, it's broken up into two axes. Now, what I want to call the x-axis, or the left to right axis on our grid, is time. Down here at the bottom, check it out. These are frame numbers, okay? So we are plotting points and plotting our keyframes along time, running from the left and right. Vertically here, these are values, and these values are going to change depending on what I have selected. So right now, I'm seeing all of these scale parameters, or excuse me, all of the scale function curves in my graph editor. So it makes sense, since we're working with scale, that we see our values communicated as percentages, okay? So if we change this over to the rotation, check it out. We've gone from percentages now into degrees, which makes sense because rotation is going to be measured in degrees. Now, navigating around our graph editor is almost identical to navigating around inside of our OpenGL viewports. So we can definitely use the viewport navigation controls. So I'm just holding down Option and Control right now in combination with my left mouse button, and I'm zooming in and out. Now, since we're working in a two-dimensional graph, we can both zoom left and right. We can get really small degrees here of control on a frame-by-frame basis. We can zoom out, and we can also zoom in vertically as well. So if we want a finer degree, a finer attenuation of adjustment on all of these values, all these degrees, we can zoom in vertically. So left and right to get a finer degree of control over each frame, and then vertically to get a finer degree of control over the value of the function curve. Okay. Another great keyboard shortcut is the A key. So I'm going to select this bottom value, hold down the Shift key and select the top one, and now we're seeing the function curves for all of our keyframes, all of the channels that are animated. Well, what if we're like really zoomed in on one, or if we can't find them? Well, hitting the A key is going to auto-fit the selected channels to the open window, which is kind of cool. And now we can see all the function curves and all the keyframe information for the channels that are showing up over here on the left. Okay, so this is one way that we could very quickly go in and adjust the location of our keyframes. The little white cubes inside the graph editor represent the current location of our keyframes. Keep in mind that left to right on the graph is time. So if I wanted to move all of these guys back, simply left-clicking and dragging back to the left here will move its position. Also, we can grab these little widgets down here at the bottom. These little vertical rectangles here represent the location of this keyframe in time. So I can select it, grab this guy, and move with confidence these values anywhere along the duration of my animation. Same with these guys. I can even do them globally if I wanted, just by left-clicking and dragging out a marquee selection box and moving them like that. Okay, so this is one way of working inside or moving keyframes around and adjusting your timing. Now, I have to caution you about working inside the graph editor. It's very, very easy to accidentally change the value of your keyframe inside the graph editor. For example, earlier I showed you that I could just grab the keyframe up here and then left-click and drag. But as I'm left-clicking and dragging, I'm actually I could accidentally move up and down in value and change how this animation is going to look inside of my timeline. So this is dangerous. I wouldn't do this unless you're really, really comfortable working in the graph editor. If the sole goal is to change the location of a keyframe, I would suggest that you open up another palette inside the animation window here in Modo. It's called the Dope Sheet. And the dope sheet is a little hidden, okay? Unfortunately, it's a little hidden, so check it out. The dope sheet can be found if we put our mouse cursor down at the bottom of our OpenGL viewport, kind of at the border between the viewport and the timeline. If I put my mouse cursor right there and then drag up, we're going to get the dope sheet. Now, the dope sheet has a lot of the same features that we just saw over in the graph editor, but what we can't change is the value of the keyframe very easily. But we can, however, change its position, its location inside the timeline. Again, just by left-clicking and dragging on any of these vertical little rectangles will allow us to very quickly go in and change where these keyframes show up inside of our timeline. So this is kind of a handy-dandy feature. We can also do multiples at the same time by holding down the Shift key and adding keyframes, okay, which is kind of cool. We can do big chunks just by dragging out a box and edit our keyframes position on our timeline like that. So we have a couple different options. I find myself using the dope sheet a lot. I'm a big fan of the dope sheet. Usually whenever I'm working on an animation, I go in and I block out all my poses, and then once I have a really strong sense of what the animation should look like, I go back in and I retime the animation to get the speed that I'm looking for. Once I have the speed and the timing established for my animation, I open up the graph editor and I really start to tweak it and do a fine polish pass on all of the movements. Okay, so the dope sheet is incredibly useful inside of this animation production pipeline. I'm going to go ahead and close the dope sheet for the time being just by left-clicking and dragging this down like that. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about in this video is how to render out an animation. And there are a couple little differences inside of Modo from rendering out still images. Let's pretend that I'm ready to submit this animation to Pixar. I think this is good enough for me to be one of their senior animators, but I need to render it so I can communicate it with them and show them, put it on my demo reel. Now, we're not going to be rendering still images like we have in the past. We want to be rendering out our entire animation. I want to render out all 120 frames of my animation. To do so, it's really easy. We're going to follow the same production pipeline that we used before for the still images, but this time we're going to go to the top of the screen where it says render, and we're going to choose render animation. Now, there are a couple things in here that you want to make sure that you look at as you go into the render stage. First and foremost, the gotcha on this is this first frame. Modo is not necessarily going to adopt the total first or the first frame value that you initially set over here in the animation window. Okay, 9 times out of 10, the first frame is always going to be set to 1, and the last frame is always going to be set to 120. It doesn't matter if the first frame of your animation is set to 10. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So if I say my first frame of my animation is 10, and the duration of my animation, or the last frame, is 50, okay? So now I'm only rendering out, the total duration of my shot is only 40 frames. Check it out. If I go to render animation, look what it automatically does. It says first frame 1, even though I set my timeline to 10, and the last frame is 120, even though I set it to 50. This is a huge landmine. You just can't hit OK blindly. You got to go in and double check, triple check to make sure that what you're rendering matches the timeline in the animation tab. Okay, this frame step value is basically going to determine how many frames are going to be rendered and in which how periodically it's going to render a frame. At a default value of 1, it's going to render every frame in the animation. If I was to set this to a value of 2, it's going to render every other frame in the animation. If I set it to 3, every third frame, so on and so forth. Now, we have 2 options when we're rendering our animations, or actually, excuse me, we have 3 options when we're rendering our animations here in Modo. We can render an image sequence, which is definitely the preferred way of doing it. We can also render a QuickTime movie. Now, I'm going to caution you against rendering out the QuickTime movie. You really don't want to do this unless this is going to be a preview quality animation. Now, why I don't recommend you rendering out a QuickTime movie is you really can't control the quality of this QuickTime movie. You can't go in and change the codec. You can't go in and change any of the codec settings. It's just going to make an MP4, and the quality of that MP4 is not going to be all that great. So this is only for like preview purposes only. I've only done this like once or twice, and I was a little bummed with the product that I got. Ideally, what you want to do is either image sequence or layered images. Image sequence is what I normally do for almost all of my production work. Now, there's a couple of reasons we in the computer graphic industry has kind of focused on the production of image sequences. When you're rendering out a QuickTime movie, the Modo is going to render out each frame, but it's going to save that frame into a temporary cached folder. Upon completion of the render, it's going to take all those temporary frames, wrap them in the QuickTime wrapper, and then write the QuickTime file to your hard disk. So really, you don't get a file permanently written on your hard disk until the entire render is complete. Now, why that's kind of a big problem for us here in the computer graphics world is that animations tend to crash, okay? Modo is rock solid. I haven't actually had a crash happen to me in Modo while I'm rendering, but in other 3D packages, I totally have, okay? So we want to kind of hedge our bets. We want to make sure that we're rendering our sequences correctly, and we only want to render them once. If there is a crash, well, we don't want to lose all the frames that were rendered before the crash happened. So the image sequence, what it's going to do is that it's going to render each frame, just like it did in the QuickTime movie, but upon completing each frame, it's permanently going to write that frame to the hard disk. So when it finishes rendering frame 1, it's going to write the file. When it finishes frame 2, it's going to write the file, and all the way up to the end of our animation. So let's say, for example, you're rendering at 100 frames. If the computer crashes on frame 95, well, you didn't lose 1 through 94. Those were already permanently saved to your hard disk if you had chosen image sequence. So if that was the situation, then you would only have to start your animation, your render at 95 all the way to 100. So you would only have to render out the remaining frames left in your sequence. So this is definitely the best way to work. It's kind of our safety net. We're guaranteeing that what we render is always going to be saved to the hard disk. Okay. Now, one thing that you want to make sure you double check before you start rendering out your frames is the location of all these frames. Okay. So, and the file format down here below. I'm a PNG guy. I love the PNG file format. It's what I use, but if you click on this list, you can see that basically all of the industry standard file formats are accepted and can be generated from the application. You're going to be getting a whole bunch of these, okay? So right now, my animation is 120 frames. So I'm going to be generating somewhere in my hard drive 120 separate image files. So definitely want to make sure that you're encompassing this inside of a folder structure. So make sure you're setting yourself up for success when you're rendering out these large animations. So that's the basics of the animation system here in Modo. So if you have any questions, you know where to get me.